At 42, I'd fallen into a rhythm that was both comforting and predictable. I lived alone in a quaint two-bedroom cottage on the edge of town, complete with shelves filled with Italian novels. Dusty with age, I worked as an Italian teacher at the local high school and took on a handful of private students. Teaching wasn't just a job, it was the hum of my life. Steady and comforting, with its predictable cadence of school bells and chalk dust, neatly scheduled lesson plans, and essays filled with Italian verbs. My little world had a way of blending days into each other. They felt warm, yes, but somehow muted, like watching life through frosted glass. Then I met Marco. It was a drizzly March afternoon, one of those early spring days when winter hadn't yet surrendered its grip. Isabella, one of my private students, was scribbling away in her notebook as I watched the rain drizzle against the windows, smudging the last traces of winter's chill. She was a bright, eager student, always punctual, always cheerful. Her father, however, was a new face, one that made an unexpected entrance that day. The door creaked open, and there he stood, an unexpected sight of disheveled hair, rain-soaked coat, and an awkward smile. "Sorry for barging in," he said, glancing around the room like he was intruding on something sacred. His shoes tracked water onto the tile, but he barely seemed to notice. I remember feeling my heart skip, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. I assured him it was fine and tried to hide my surprise. After all, I wasn't used to parents dropping by mid-lesson, much less someone with a look that managed to be both apologetic and, well, charming. There was an earnestness in his eyes as he watched Isabella gathering her things. Excitement in his face when she prattled on about the lesson. A devoted father, I thought. Maybe he was curious about this teacher his daughter seemed so fond of. Italian is a beautiful language, I told him when he complimented my teaching. It deserves a little passion. He gave a half smile, one that lingered just long enough for me to feel it later. Like the gentle warmth of the rain that misted the day. It was an innocuous exchange. But as he left with Isabella, something small but insistent flickered inside me. I couldn't know then that this was the first step in a path that would soon take me far beyond the world I knew. Deeper into lives I hadn't imagined. What began with casual conversations and a community event soon led me further into Marco's world. I became the confidant, the warm, welcoming presence that his children seemed to crave. I never questioned how it happened, how my life, once so quiet and enclosed, had expanded to fit not only Marco but his children, too. Matteo and Isabella felt familiar from the beginning. Like friends I'd somehow forgotten to meet. Matteo had his father's steady gaze, an intensity softened by a boyish laugh, and Isabella's innocence reminded me why I loved teaching in the first place. Every shared meal, every soft moment in their home felt like peeling back a layer I hadn't realized I'd been wearing, a protective layer that came with being alone for so long. The transition into their home was so gradual. It felt almost seamless. I didn't move in overnight. I started by helping with errands. Then dinner prep. Then homework help. They'd invite me to stay longer, one evening blending into the next. Soon, their lives became woven into mine. I remember spending Saturday afternoons helping Isabella with her spelling or watching Matteo show off his newest art projects. The first time I walked through the door with an overnight bag, there was a strange kind of excitement and terror mixed together in my heart. It felt surreal, like stepping into a new chapter without knowing what came next. The cozy corners of Marco's home, the smells of fresh brewed coffee and the kids' laughter, began to replace the quiet of my own space. There was no longer just the sound of my own footsteps filling the rooms. Now, there was movement, life, a sense of belonging that felt thrilling and unfamiliar. But life has its seasons, each one shifting as naturally as leaves changing in the fall. What started with innocent, shared laughter would become more complex. There were times when I'd notice Marco's gaze linger, a warmth in his eyes that softened my own guarded heart. This new family, however, wasn't as simple as I'd hoped. If there was a moment when things began to change, it was Rosa's arrival. Rosa was a force in her own right, a woman of few words. Her presence filled any room, demanding attention even in silence. She had a sense of authority, of belonging, that overshadowed my more tentative place in Marco's home. I admired her strength and dedication, but as the weeks turned into months, I could feel the weight of caring for her pressing down on me. My life, once filled with books and classes, with plans and dreams, became centered on the needs of the household. I found myself putting others first, and then second, until there was little left of me. The people who once filled my days with warmth grew distant. Matteo was entering his teenage years, drawing into himself, While Isabella, once so eager to share her world with me, seemed preoccupied with friends, even Marco felt farther away, distracted by work and responsibilities. Still, I told myself this was temporary, a phase that every family went through. I felt an obligation to keep things running smoothly, even if it meant spending my nights washing dishes alone, or sitting with Rosa when she woke in pain at odd hours. Somehow, the very rhythm that once defined my world now felt more like a chain, pulling me further from the person I once was. When I look back, I wonder if I'd ignored the signs for too long, or if life simply piled on all at once. It started with small aches and pains, moments when my legs felt heavier, my energy drained. I chalked it up to stress, to the constant responsibility of holding everyone together. But the fatigue lingered, becoming a dull ache that sapped my strength, spreading from my bones outward until even the simplest tasks became monumental. One day, I had to admit to myself that I couldn't keep up with my teaching, that my health had taken something from me I couldn't retrieve. I resigned from my job at the private school, the loss hitting me harder than I'd anticipated. Without my classes, I felt unmoored, as if I'd lost a part of my identity. The house, the people I'd given everything for, felt like they were slipping away, becoming a place of silence and cold glances. I felt like a stranger, not just to them, but to myself. But even through the distance, I held on, refusing to give up on the family I'd come to love. And so I made the decision to start teaching online, creating a small but steady purpose out of the ruins of what I'd lost. My first few lessons reignited a spark within me, a reminder of why I'd started teaching in the first place. The connection, the thrill of language, the joy of seeing students learn, it all came back to me. And for a while, it filled the void Marco and his children had left. The more I settled into my role within Marco's family, the more I felt pieces of myself slipping away. I had allowed myself to believe that my sacrifices were noble, that they were for the sake of love, of family. But I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that grew with each passing day. I was there to care for everyone, yet I was left feeling like I didn't belong. My health was slipping faster than I admitted. One morning, while making breakfast, I felt a sharp pain radiate up my legs. I had to sit down, breathing slowly as the pain dulled but lingered like a shadow. I glanced at Marco, who was on his way out the door, briefcase in hand. He didn't ask if I was all right. Maybe he didn't notice. Or maybe, I thought, he simply didn't care anymore. The children, too, had become distant. Matteo, now a teenager, had little patience for me, often rolling his eyes or sighing in irritation whenever I spoke. Isabella, once so sweet and full of curiosity, had become withdrawn and irritable. It felt as though I'd slipped into a role I didn't understand, no longer the loved stepmother but something more invisible. A ghost occupying their home. It was in this haze of loneliness that I began teaching online. My setup was humble: a laptop perched on my bedroom desk, a few Italian language books stacked beside me, and a small Italian flag that I kept as a reminder of my heritage. I remember my first student, a young woman from Texas with a passion for travel. Her excitement was contagious, and by the end of the session, I was grinning. In those hours, I felt myself come alive, connected to my purpose once again. This online teaching became my escape, a place where I was valued, where my voice mattered. As the weeks passed, I built a modest reputation among my students. It was fulfilling work, and each session left me feeling lighter. The small earnings I made went into a separate account, and for the first time in months, I felt a sliver of independence returning to my life. One evening, Marco announced his plans to move. He mentioned a new house, a fresh start for himself and the kids. I remember the words striking me like a blow, leaving me in silence as he spoke. He was animated, talking about the new neighborhood, the schools, and the potential he saw for his children there. I waited for him to mention me, to acknowledge that this change included us all. But he didn't. Finally, I managed to ask, "So, when do we start planning for the move?" He barely looked at me. "There's no we, Laura. The house is for me and the kids. I thought you'd have figured that out by now." His tone was curt, dismissive. I was left stunned, a rush of emotion swelling in my chest. My voice, weak but steady, managed to ask why. His answer was a simple, "It's just not working out." As if the years I had spent pouring myself into his family, sacrificing my own well-being, and even my career, meant nothing. "We're doing fine on our own, Laura. We don't need you around." For a few heartbeats, I felt the earth shift beneath me. Everything I had done for them, all the times I had ignored my own needs, my own dreams, had led to this moment. I was, in his eyes, disposable. The family I had given so much to had no need for me. It was both a heartbreaking and liberating realization. I felt the pang of rejection but also a strange sense of clarity. The day I packed my things and left was surreal. I took only what was mine, the few books that had been my constant companions, my teaching materials, and clothes. Marco and the children barely looked up as I passed them, moving through the house in a quiet haze of finality. Their indifference stung, but it was also freeing. I realized that I had allowed myself to fade into the background, a quiet presence that they could take for granted. Now, I was reclaiming that presence. My new apartment was small, modest, and located on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I decorated it slowly, savoring each addition, a plant here, a framed picture of the Italian countryside there. I set up my desk by a window overlooking a park, the perfect spot for my online classes. It became a sanctuary of peace and independence. Each morning, I woke up to a space that felt fully mine, where I answered to no one but myself. Teaching Italian online had become more than a source of income, it was my lifeline. My student list grew steadily, and I found myself filled with the joy of sharing my love for the language. My students came from all walks of life, each one bringing the unique passion for learning. They were eager, respectful, and, perhaps most importantly, appreciative of the work I did. My classes filled the empty spaces that Marco and his family had left behind. I felt myself grow in confidence, in strength, reclaiming the parts of myself that I had once sacrificed. Months passed, and I found myself thriving in my new life. Marco's absence felt like a shadow that had finally lifted. The bitterness I'd once felt began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of justice. I had no intention of seeking revenge. Life had a way of settling its own scores. But when a former colleague reached out, mentioning that Marco was facing issues at work, I couldn't ignore the feeling of vindication that stirred within me. During the darkest days of my marriage, I had kept a few recordings, moments when Marco's voice dripped with contempt as he dismissed and belittled me. Those recordings, at the time, were my only proof, my only way of holding on to the reality of what I had endured. I never thought I'd use them. But now, hearing of his troubles, I knew what I had to do. I sent the recordings anonymously to his employer, aware of their policies against abusive behavior. Within weeks, I heard from mutual acquaintances that Marco had been demoted, his salary slashed, and his reputation tarnished. It wasn't revenge I was after, it was justice. The quiet kind, where the world simply saw Marco for who he truly was. With Marco and his children fading from my life, I found myself standing on a foundation built solely by my own hands. I no longer thought of myself as the woman who'd been discarded. I was Laura, the Italian teacher, the woman who had rebuilt her life from the ground up. My days were filled with classes, laughter, and the thrill of watching my students learn. My earnings grew, allowing me to save more than I had ever been able to while living with Marco. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, my laptop open, as I reviewed my finances. It was an empowering moment, knowing that my earnings, my achievements, were all mine. I began to think of Italy again, of traveling, of seeing the places I'd once only read about. I wasn't afraid of dreaming anymore. The world, once narrow and defined by others' expectations, had expanded, filled with possibilities that were mine to explore. The last I heard, Marco and his children were struggling. Their new home was sold, and they'd had to downsize to a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a poetic twist of fate, one I observed with a mixture of detachment and a sense of quiet satisfaction. Their cruelty, once my prison, was now their own cage. As for me, my world had opened in ways I hadn't expected. I started taking long walks, savoring the peace of my new life. I even found myself reconnecting with old friends, sharing laughter over coffee and talks of future travels. Italy still called to me, but this time I knew I'd be visiting it on my own terms. My journey had been long, filled with sacrifice, pain, and betrayal, but it had brought me to a place of strength and resilience I hadn't known was possible. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive, truly free. I had reclaimed my life, piece by piece, leaving behind the shadows of my past. Now, as I look forward, I know that my life will be filled with the things I value: peace, fulfillment, and a purpose built on my own terms. Marco and his family are but a chapter in a story that has only just begun. My apartment was modest, a far cry from the home I had once shared with Marco and the children. But it felt like a palace in comparison. For the first time in years, I could walk from room to room without fear of criticism or cold glances. I felt a lightness I hadn't known was possible. In this space, each room reflected pieces of myself that I had hidden away for too long. A shelf for my Italian novels, a corner filled with plants, a small collection of souvenirs from students, all were little signs of my independence. Each morning, I woke up to a life that was entirely mine. My online teaching had become not only my livelihood but a source of joy and pride. My students, ranging from young children to retirees, each brought their own unique excitement to learning Italian. The days I spent teaching felt fulfilling in a way I hadn't experienced in years. With every lesson, I found new energy, a reminder of the passion that had drawn me to teaching in the first place. What was surprising was how little I missed Marco and the children. There were no memories that brought longing or sorrow, only lessons about what I had allowed myself to tolerate. I found strength in knowing that I'd faced a difficult situation and emerged stronger, more aware of who I was and what I wanted. One afternoon, as I was packing away my laptop after a particularly uplifting session, I received a message from an old colleague. She wanted to catch up, to hear about my life since I'd left the school. I invited her over, and as we sipped tea in my cozy living room, she mentioned something that piqued my interest. "Did you hear about Marco?" she asked, a tone of disbelief in her voice. "He's having a rough time, they say, got demoted at work and is struggling to make ends meet." I let the words sink in. I hadn't heard from Marco since I'd left, and I hadn't expected to. I knew they had moved into a new house after I left, and I imagined him enjoying the comforts of that life without a thought of me. But hearing about his troubles didn't bring satisfaction. Instead, it gave me pause, a sense of peace I hadn't expected. It was like a quiet justice had been served, a kind that didn't need vindictive words or actions. But as I remembered those dark days, I realized that some parts of that life still lingered. Small scars I carried in silence. Those memories, the words he had used to belittle me, were stored away in recordings I'd made, small tokens of the emotional toll I'd endured. In a moment of clarity, I realized these recordings no longer served me. They were weights I didn't need to carry, reminders of a pain I'd overcome. I sent him anonymously to his employer, aware of the strict policies on respectful conduct. And with that one act, I felt the last pieces of that life fall away, freeing me to focus entirely on my own happiness. I didn't need to know what happened after. It was enough that I had finally closed the door on that chapter. In the months that followed, my life blossomed in unexpected ways. I was no longer just Laura the teacher. I was Laura, a woman standing on her own, creating a life rich in meaning and peace. Each day brought me small joys that I hadn't noticed in years, the early morning light streaming through my window, the scent of freshly brewed coffee, the thrill of a new student eager to learn. I relished the quietude of my days, knowing that each decision, each moment, was mine. My schedule filled up as word spread of my teaching, and I found myself saving more than I'd ever thought possible. Slowly, I began to make plans for a future I'd once thought unreachable. Italy had always been a dream, a place I talked about but had never truly considered visiting. But now, I found myself looking up flights, reading about the villages I'd always taught my students about, and picturing myself wandering those old Italian streets, free to explore without restrictions or expectations. One evening, I finally booked a flight to Rome. It was a small step but felt monumental, a promise to myself that I would never again let anyone or anything keep me from the life I wanted. I poured a glass of wine, toasted to myself, and made a vow to live each day as fully as I could, in honor of the woman I had fought so hard to reclaim. On a bright morning in late spring, I boarded the plane to Italy. The thrill of the journey, the anticipation of exploring a place that had always lived in my dreams, filled me with a joy that was hard to contain. As I looked out over the city of Rome from my airplane seat, I felt a sense of homecoming, a place I had longed to see, a piece of myself finally coming to life. The journey through those cobbled streets and vibrant piazzas was everything I had imagined and more. I felt alive in a way that was new, whole, and entirely my own. I was no longer Laura who had sacrificed everything for the sake of a family that never truly accepted me. I was Laura, a woman who had come full circle, finding strength and purpose in the midst of hardship. As I sat at a cafe overlooking the bustling streets of Rome, sipping a cappuccino, I thought of all that had led me here, the years of sacrifice, the betrayal, the pain, and, ultimately, the liberation. Those memories no longer haunted me. They had become stepping stones, parts of a journey that had shaped me but no longer defined me. I was no longer bound by my past, and I felt a calm sense of gratitude for the life I had finally claimed as my own. In the distance, a group of tourists passed, chattering in Italian, and I couldn't help but smile. This was my world now, full, vibrant, and bursting with possibility. I was ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that I had built this life through resilience, courage, and an unyielding belief in my own worth. And for the first time, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be.